Hello and welcome to Christmas Campfire Part 2. It's more like a New Year campfire though. I spent a little bit more time with my family than I intended, but it was nice over Christmas. I had a nice quiet Christmas, played a lot of board games, played a like murder mystery type game, which was quite fun. You get like a case file and you have to go through all the evidence and stuff and figure out like suspects and motives and alibis and stuff. That was quite cool. Anyway, yeah, I had a nice Christmas, but did sort of extend a little bit further than I expected. So this Christmas campfire now is more like a New Year campfire. On that note, I wish you all a very happy New Year. And by the time you listen to this, should be January the 1st. So happy New Year. Let's all fingers crossed that 2026 will be a little bit easier going than 2025, eh? Anyway, let's move along with the story, shall we? The first story we've got is from Matthew. And Matthew says, "Hi Ben, how are you? I just wanted to send this email for your Christmas campfire stories. I'm a really big fan of your podcast." Thanks very much, Matthew. He says, "I'm an avid horror enthusiast and love a good mystery and chilling story, especially at Christmas. I love the long-forgotten tradition of telling spooky stories at Christmas time. Despite this, I'm quite a non-believer and have always believed in Occam's razor. Even so, I've been told all sorts of different stories and had some strange encounters, one of which I'd love to tell you for your Christmas campfire. This is actually my father's story, one that he swears is true and has recanted many times over the years. During the 1970s and 80s, my father grew up in a small mining community in the northeast of England before the miners' strike led to the closure. He's the youngest of 3 sons, and both of his brothers have assured me that their experience is true. During their youth, their parents found a new house in their local area that had recently come on the market. It suited their needs, despite being a 2-bed house. My dad and his brothers all shared one room in their new house, and their parents had the other room. It didn't take long before moving into the house that my dad and his brothers started noticing something strange. When they were all lying in bed at night, they could swear that they could hear the distinct sound of footsteps outside their room on the hallway landing. They were all certain of this sound and said that they could hear it very clearly. The sound of the creaking floorboards moving backwards and forwards. Lying there in the dark, they would sometimes try to spook each other out, but they would often rationalise the sound as their parents moving about during the night, going to the bathroom, having a cigarette, or listening out to make sure that the boys were asleep. Even so, whenever they heard this noise, they all grew very uneasy, and all of them would refuse to step out onto the landing at night. This carried on for a long time, until they all moved out of the house and onto their next home. It wasn't until many years later that they may have gained an insight into what happened during those nights in the house. As I said earlier, my family grew up in a very small community where everyone knew everyone. My grandparents explained to them how they came into possession of the house all those years ago. You see, they'd both known the previous occupant, a man named Mr. Swan. He was a local known to most people, and it turned out that Mr. Swan had died by committing suicide on the hallway landing. I hope you enjoy the story. It chilled us hearing about it from my dad. I hope it makes your campfire stories, and have a very Merry Christmas to you. Thanks very much, Matthew. I hope you had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and thank you for your story. I totally feel you when you say, you're quite a non-believer, but, I've always sort of been upfront about the fact that I'm fairly well sceptical, but it never stops me enjoying a good story and, considering the possibilities of things and stuff. So, yeah, thank you very much for your story. This next one comes from Ryan. And Ryan says, "This story was told to me when I was about 8 or 9 years old by my grandmother. I don't recall all the details, as this was a rough time in my life, and I'm now 37. Supposedly, this actually happened to her, my grandmother's relative, and was told to the family over the years. It was sometime in the late 1920s, or maybe the early 1930s. A young couple was travelling west through Pennsylvania, bound for Pittsburgh, to spend the Christmas holidays with family. They'd been on the road all afternoon with their car rattling along the 2-lane highway as the snow began to fall harder and harder. By nightfall, the storm had blanketed the countryside in thick white, the world outside their windshield swirling into a blur. The road had all but disappeared beneath their tyres, and the husband could barely see beyond the beam of the headlights. The wind howled, and the snow stung on the glass. After several near skids, they both agreed that it was no longer safe to drive, so they promised each other that they would stop at the very next place that they found. A few miles down, just when they were beginning to wonder if they would make it much further, a faint glow appeared through the storm. It was a house. It was an old farmhouse with a warm light in the windows. They pulled the car up the long drive and knocked at the door, half hoping that someone would answer. To their relief, the door opened and there stood an elderly couple, white-haired, wrinkled and gentle-looking. The older man and woman welcomed them in without hesitation. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and stew. They insisted that their stranded guests sit down by the fire and fed them a hearty meal and offered a snug spare room for the night. The young couple slept deeply, grateful for such kindness in the midst of a storm. In the morning, the skies had cleared and the roads were passable again. Before leaving, the old couple prepared them a simple breakfast. As the travellers bundled up their coats and made their thanks, the husband discreetly placed a gold coin on the table as a gesture of gratitude. He thought it better not to hand it to them directly, but to leave it behind as a quiet gift. They drove on and arrived in Pittsburgh, sharing the strange good fortune of the night with their family, who agreed how remarkable it was that such gracious people had taken them in. After the holidays, when it came time to drive home, the couple decided that they'd bring a New Year's gift as a token of thanks to the farmers who had sheltered them. They retraced their route, scanning the snowy landscape, until they finally recognised the spot. But when they pulled into the drive, their hearts sank. The farmhouse was there, yet it looked entirely different now. Windows were broken and shutters hung loose. The roof had sagged and there was no light shining inside. The place looked long abandoned. Quite perplexed, they drove on until they came to a service station a few miles down the road. The husband asked the attendant about the farmhouse, explaining that they'd stayed there just a week before. The attendant raised an eyebrow and shook his head. "That place," he said, "ain't been lived in for 30 years, maybe more. Old couples used to have it. Name was..." He gave a pair of names. The husband blinked, and they were the very names of their hosts. "But that can't be," the husband protested. "We stayed with them. They cooked us supper. They gave us a bed." The station man shrugged. "Them folks passed a long time ago. House has been falling apart ever since." Unwilling to believe it, the couple drove back to the farmhouse. Curiosity and unease drove the husband from the car, and he pushed the creaking door open on its rotting hinges. He stepped inside the cold, dust-caked ruin. The fireplace was dark, the air was stale, everything was covered in cobwebs and neglect. Then he saw it. On the dining table, crusted in dust, lay a single gold coin, the very one that he had left only days ago. He picked it up and the weight was cold and solid in his hand. When he stepped back outside, pale and shaken, his wife searched his eyes. He opened his palm and she saw the coin. She gasped aloud. Together they stood staring up at the farmhouse, silent, ruined and impossibly empty. They got back in their car and drove away, carrying with them a story no one could quite explain. Wish you a happy holiday season and New Year's from Baltimore. Yeah, and you too, Ryan. Thank you very much for your story. I do love, I kind of like it's a bit ambiguous. Like I'm kind of going, that's a bit of a time slip, but whether or not you think it's kind of guardian angels or time slip, I don't know. I quite like the idea of a time slip. Anyway, thank you very much for your story. The next one comes from Jack, and he says, "Hi Ben, love the show. I've been listening for years." Apologies, Jack. I'm sorry. He says, "I always look forward to the campfire. I've worked in the police on response for most of my career. And to be honest, I'm not someone who buys into the paranormal. I've been to plenty of strange jobs over the years, but nothing I'd ever call supernatural. Except for one thing. It was early on in my service, and I still think about it from time to time, so I thought I'd finally send it in. Here you go. I was based for a while in the west of London. On my first borough was this old Victorian nick, proper brick and iron, the kind of place that felt cold even in summer. It was run down even back then, and all that was left in use at the time were a couple of writing rooms and a canteen containing two very temperamental vending machines. Down in the basement, they still had a row of cells, long out of use, just piled high with boxes and broken furniture. No one liked going down there unless they had to. On nights, you'd pull in either for paperwork or for a comfort break, and almost straight away you'd hear things. Everyone did, though no one admitted it until you'd been there a bit. Low voices, sometimes faint like a radio, tuned just off station, coming from a part of the building where there definitely wasn't a radio. Then there was the main event, the banging. Always the same, one sharp, solid hit, like someone smacking the flat of their hand against a cell door. The first time I heard it, I was with my partner for the shift. We pulled in around 2, maybe 3 in the morning, catching up on paperwork in the ground floor writing room. I just sat down and flipped open my pocketbook when it came. One loud bang from the corridor leading to the basement stairs. It echoed right through the floor. I froze. My pocketbook slipped straight out of my hands. My partner had been in the job almost 20 years, someone we'd refer to as an old sweat, and he didn't even look up from his notes. He just muttered, as casually as he was ordering a cup of tea, "I wouldn't dwell on it, mate. Poor bastard's been down there longer than you or I've been alive." We checked it later, of course. Every door locked, every cell empty besides the storage. The air down there seemed cold enough to fog your breath. The story my colleagues used to tell, half joking and half not, went back to when they still ran custody out of that basement. They had a violent drunk, always in and out for scraps in the pubs, picking fights with anyone who looked at him sideways. One night, he properly kicked off. He took a swing at one of the custody sergeants in the rear yard, so they dragged him down the stairs and chucked him in a cell to cool off. Except he didn't cool off. He went to the door with his boots and fists, shouting every threat under the sun, and then begging to be let out. They just left him. Back then, there weren't the checks we have now. At some point in the night, he went quiet. They thought he'd passed out. When they opened up in the morning, he was dead. Officially, it was ruled natural causes, heart failure maybe. Others said he'd choked on his own vomit. And a few of the older hands muttered something else, that he'd been banging and shouting so hard that night that he'd burst something inside himself. The inquiry afterwards shut the basement down for good. But the way people told it, he hadn't been banging because he was angry. He'd been banging because he was terrified. Because something was in that cell with him. Something that he saw or felt just before he died. And whatever happened down there, however it ended, neither of them ever really left. I made a point of avoiding that nick as much as possible after that, especially on the night shifts. These days, it's gone, closed up properly a couple of years after I transferred out. I spoke to a friend of mine who's still working on the borough before writing to you, and he told me that the building's been stripped, refurbished and turned into office space, all bright lights, new carpets, the whole lot. He's in touch with a few of the people working there now, and rumour has it that they sealed off the old basement completely during the renovation. They just bricked it up. But every so often, someone swears they hear that single, sharp bang from beneath their feet. Thanks very much, Jack. That was a great story. And I couldn't help but sort of slip into slight kind of London policeman accent or London policeman in my head accent there. Thank you very much for your story. It's a cracker. Did also sort of make me laugh when you said that it had been turned into cold, bright office space, like pretty much everything in London. It's luxury flats or office space. The next story comes from Darren. And Darren says, "Hello, Ben. I have a short story about something that happened to me that I cannot explain. This past February, our youngest daughter was feeling under the weather. At bedtime, my wife went to her room to help her settle and presumably fell asleep next to our daughter. I fell asleep shortly after in our own bedroom. After an uneventful sleep, I woke up around my usual time of 6 a.m. I wasn't in a big hurry to get out of bed, as it was quite a cold, and if you can have to excuse me, I think this is right, but it says, it was quite a cold Saskatchewan winter night when overnight temperatures regularly go below minus 30 C. I think that's the right. I don't know. I apologise if it's not. Anyway, it says, I should mention, I have long been in the habit of draping a t-shirt over my eyes as I like to sleep in complete darkness. I've never liked a proper sleep mask. This is a habit that I started during my night shift worker days many years ago. As stated, that morning I was lying in bed, fully conscious, and had started compiling a mental list of things I needed to do for that day. I hadn't removed the t-shirt from my face, but I want to emphasise that I was definitely not in a dream-like state or anything of that sort. I'd been fully awake for a few minutes at this point, when I felt a sort of depression on the edge of the bed mattress directly beside me, as if the weight of a person had just sat on the bed. This was in no way alarming, as my wife has done this before when she wants to gently wake me up. Assuming that she was sitting on the side of my bed, I did have a brief moment of confusion, wondering why she was up so early. It was a weekend and she didn't have to get up for work. Simultaneously, I instantly removed the t-shirt from my eyes and was somewhat shocked when no one was there. I confirmed my wife was still sleeping in her daughter's room. I'm a rational person who has tried to come up with a rational explanation, but I'm stumped. As a way of further explanation, I have experienced sleep paralysis on a couple of occasions, and I know this was not it. Any thoughts or explanations would be much appreciated, as something similar to the weight of a person caused this sensation. Thanks for your show, I enjoy it very much. Merry Christmas to all, Darren. So yeah, thank you very much, Darren. I have absolutely no explanation for that whatsoever. I tell you what, I agree, it definitely doesn't sound like sleep paralysis. I've had sleep paralysis a good handful of times, and I never got like physical sensations like that. For me, it was always like this, the feeling of oppression was kind of there, but not really so much like a physical thing. So yeah, good luck. I suggest that you try not to think about it too much. As the next story comes from Steph, and Steph says, "Hey Ben, long-time listener, first-time caller. This is a pretty dark one, so I totally understand if you don't want to read it aloud on the pod. A few years ago, my ex, who I had maintained a friendship with after our 3-year-long relationship, ended his life in a very impulsive way. On top of some pretty heavy mental health issues, he struggled with alcoholism and unfortunately made a permanent decision to a temporary problem while fighting with the woman that he was seeing at the time. I'm sorry to hear about that, Steph." Steph goes on, "About 6 months later, I had a dream where I somehow manifested his spirit into my bedroom. He seemed well enough when he appeared, less distressed than his former self. And I asked him, 'Where are you? Where did you go? Will we see each other again?' He smiled sadly and replied, 'There are only 2 places to go. I went to one and you'll go to another.' He was gone, but the dream continued on, nonsensically, to some other setting, as dreams tend to do. I received a text message on my phone and looked down to see that it was from his 14-year-old daughter. The message read, 'I'm here with my dad. I just wanted to let you know we're okay and not to worry.' I woke up thinking that this was all a little strange, but I mean, most dreams are. I do have a tendency to dream about events or subjects that come up in my life the next day, but it's always something really uninteresting or unimportant. Something like I'll have a dream with an old obscure movie reference in it, and next day at work, a client will bring up that same movie in conversation. So yeah, nothing groundbreaking in the way of predicting the future, but still synchronistic enough to notice. I honestly believe we all kind of tap into the collective consciousness while we dream, so we all probably do this a bit. I'm just a heavy dreamer and I record things a lot, so I have a pretty good memory for it. Anyway, I thought the dream was weirdly comforting, but I didn't think too much of it. A few days later, however, I received the news that his daughter had also taken her life days prior. It's incredibly tragic and heartbreaking, and upon learning this, I was obviously in complete shock. It was a day or two before I even remembered the dream and put it together. I've always been a curious participant in dream interpretation and exploring consciousness, but I don't think I'd ever had a dream so literal. If anything, it's made me even more diligent of journaling my dreams and active imagination experiences. I honestly don't know what I believe exactly. I'd call myself an optimistic skeptic when it comes to most things paranormal or supernatural, but this experience was definitely a bit eerie. Happy holidays from Denver, Colorado. Happy holidays to you too. Thank you so much for your story, and obviously that's a very personal and quite tragic story. And so yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that. In terms of what happened, I do not know, but I liked your term optimistic skeptic. I can relate to that. So yeah, thank you very much for your story. The next story comes from Andy. Andy says, "Hi Ben, I've been listening to your podcast for several years now, and when this time of year rolls around, I always think about writing in something for the Christmas Campfire, but I always end up forgetting to do it. So this year, I've resolved to write in with a couple of paranormal experiences that I have to share. These both happened when I was younger. The first one, I must have been about 6 or 7. We've recently moved to a house, not very far, still in the same village really, in the northeast of England, near a town called Middlesbrough. The house we've moved into was, and still is, a small bungalow with a converted loft. I think my parents hoped that I'd be keen to have a loft as my bedroom, but I never really fancied that. I found it quite spooky, to be honest, climbing up a rickety set of metal ladders that you could slide up and out of the way when it wasn't in use. At the top of the ladder, there was a door with a weird shape that mirrored the slope of the roof, and it led into the eaves. You could technically walk around the whole of the roof space if you stayed on the beams, but we mainly used the little 2 square metres behind the door as a bit of storage space, as it hadn't been boarded up properly. The door could open really wide, into the room and back on its hinges, so it was almost 180 degrees to the opening. I hope that makes sense how I'm describing it. Anyway, we hadn't been moved in long, and while I wasn't keen to have my bedroom up in the loft, My parents had put my desktop computer up there, so if I wanted to play on that, I needed to be upstairs in the loft. I remember both of my parents were outside. I think my mum was across the road talking to the neighbours, and my dad was in the garage. So I was alone in the house, playing Doom, I think. I remember when I was younger, I'd sometimes freak myself out playing scary games or watching horror films, so I'd never really been a fan of either, but I didn't have much else to play on my computer at the time, so Doom it was. I remember glancing across at the open door that led into the eaves and felt a bit uncomfortable with it being there. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see much in it, just darkness. The door was open fully, and so was at almost 180 degrees, as I mentioned before. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the door slammed shut in one move, all the way across. I stood up, said, "Okay, sorry, I'll go now," to nobody in particular, and I climbed down the rickety ladder as quick as I could without looking around too much at anything in the loft space. There must have been some real force behind the door for it to shut like that, and all these years later, I still can't really explain why it did that. The loft was always really cold, and I suppose there could have been a draft, but it was just so weird to me how the door closed the way it did. It seems impossible. I asked for the computer to be moved downstairs after that, and I spent as little time as possible in the loft after that, and for the rest of the time that I lived in that house. My other story is a bit less scary, but it's interesting to me because it involves several members of my family, all experiencing the same thing. When I was in my mid-teens, my auntie on my dad's side passed away, and my close family all got drafted in to help clean her house for it to be sold. My auntie had lived in that house since she was born, and for a long time with her sister, and then, when she passed, on her own. My mum and dad would often go over to help her over the years and make sure that she was okay. But there was a lot of stuff to clean and move out when she did pass on, so we needed everyone to help. There was me, my mum and my dad, my two sisters, who were both a fair bit older than I am, and my sister's daughter, who was around my age. I always found this house a bit spooky too when I was younger, but with everyone there, it was actually quite nice to do something as a group, and I really didn't mind all the work that we had to do to get the house into a more livable state. On the last day of the last weekend we were at the house, I remember I'd been on the top floor, painting the walls and ceilings on the landing at the top of the stairs. I think maybe on the floor below was my mum, one of my sisters and her daughter, and on the bottom floor was my dad and my other sister. This was a big terraced house with 3 floors from the 1800s. It was getting late in the day, and we were all pretty much done and in fairly good spirits. I'd finished my last bit of painting and had the paint roller on an extendable pole in my right hand, and was just kind of leaning on it a bit and checking to see if I'd missed any bits. While I was looking up, I felt a sensation like a hand gently resting on my right shoulder. I remember that it felt so much like somebody just resting their hand there, but I didn't feel scared or anything. Quite the opposite, I felt very relaxed and calm. After a few seconds, the feeling stopped and I went downstairs to check on everyone else, and I didn't really give any more thought to the sensation of a hand on my shoulder at all. We then all went back to my parents' house and we ordered in some Chinese food to reward ourselves. Whilst we were eating, I remembered the sensation of the hand on my shoulder, and I brought it up, jokingly saying that maybe it was our auntie giving us a pat on the back. The younger of my 2 sisters' jaw dropped and she stared at me. She told me that she had also felt a hand on her shoulder just as we were wrapping up and getting ready to go home. My other sister then looked a bit freaked out and said that she had also felt something on her shoulder, but that she hadn't wanted to say anything at the time. We still mention it even now. The younger of my 2 sisters is very into ghosts and paranormal stuff. My older sister isn't really, and as I've gotten older, I've found that I like the stories, but I don't really put much stock in any of them being true. I've worked in loads of supposedly haunted pubs when I was a student at uni, at all hours of the day, and I've never seen anything else that stuck with me quite as much as my 2 stories above. I hope these are worth writing in, and the autocorrect on my phone hasn't done too much for disservice to the legibility of them. Thanks for all your work on the podcast, and also on Yesterday Today, which I've also been enjoying. Merry Christmas too, even though it feels weird to write that in October when I'm sending this in. Yeah, thank you very much. So a few of these stories, I should say, I got the emails as early as January last year, actually. So they've just been stored up for now. So yeah, thanks, Andy. And don't worry, you said that you certainly weren't the first to write in, even though it was a little bit early. It's was certainly not the earliest, don't worry. The next story comes from Doug. And Doug says, "Hi Ben, your podcast is spectacular." Well, that is some wordage. Thank you very much, Doug. He says, "I especially enjoy the paranormal stuff. I have a story for Christmas Campfire, perhaps. In 1995, I was living in Merida, Venezuela, teaching English at a small institute. A friend, Sam, had promised an adventure, a visit to see a medium, someone whom, supposedly, entities could speak through. I didn't know what to expect, but curiosity carried me and a few others down from the green, misty highlands into a dry, sunny desert. The group was nervous. People speculated over what might happen and if it was worth the long trip. When we stopped, it was at a small river. Its banks were lined with willows. The air was still and the medium was waiting there for us. We sat in a semicircle beneath the trees and she began. First, she said the Lord's Prayer, which was a little freaky for some reason. Then she pulled a cigar from her pocket, lit it, inhaled a few puffs, and suddenly she tossed it into the air. The cigar spun like a propeller and landed perfectly upright, like a rocket, as if she was controlling gravity. I would never, in 1,000 attempts, be able to do that. Next came a razor blade. She took it out, cut the tip of her tongue, and blood ran down her chin. And then she was ready for us. One by one, she led us to the riverbank under the willows, and then she channeled what I would describe as 3 distinct entities. I thought of them as human somehow. They had human voices at least, and it was just so clearly just not her speaking. Plus her whole body took on 3 distinct and complete sets of movements and mannerisms. First there was a woman, middle-aged, then a young man, then an old man. It was, in retrospect, the creepiest thing that I've ever experienced. But at the time, I wasn't really freaking out. The voices were distinct, layered with character, with unique timbres and cadences that seemed impossible for one human to produce. And here is the slightly disappointing end to this story. I don't really remember anything that I was told. Not a word. I'm older now, but I never could remember. I remember the cigar spinning, the blood dripping, and the willows, and the van ride, and the desert. I remember everything, except what the voices told me. So that's it. Merry or happy Christmas to everyone. Yes, thank you very much for your story. It's quite a weird one. That I think the woman would certainly have freaked me out. The cutting the tongue would have freaked me out by itself. But yeah, really interesting that you couldn't recall like anything that she said to you afterwards. That would almost certainly have had me up probably more than a few nights wondering about what she might have said. I would be really curious to like maybe go some sort of like hypnotherapy or something to see if you can find out. So this next story comes from Lindsay. And Lindsay says, "Hello Ben, I've been a loyal listener for years and have thought about sending you this story for your Christmas Campfire episode many times, but I've honestly always chickened out. I'm not sure why exactly, but maybe it's because writing it out makes the fact that it happened seem more real. Anyway, I'm just going to dive in before I talk myself out of it again. Here goes. I lived in a mid-sized city on the shores of Lake Erie in an area commonly known as the Rust Belt. Our community was a huge fishing and manufacturing hub about 100 years ago, but much of that industry has faded away over time, leaving the shells of empty factories and disused railroad tracks. The residents that remain here are a plucky group. Many of us have had to get creative about devising work for ourselves. About 15 years ago, I started a business that cleans commercial properties, medical facilities, gyms, office suites and the like. One of our cleaning sites was a small neighbourhood bar that sits on a bluff overlooking the bay. It's a club-type bar where you pay a modest yearly fee to join and are able to enjoy inexpensive drinks and meals. Inside, you find all of the fixtures of a typical establishment of this type: a pool table, a jukebox, a small bowling area, and a few scattered electronic gambling machines in a constant residual haze of smokiness and dim lighting. Lining the walls are old sepia photos of the founding members of the club, sailors and shipbuilders from the late 1800s, staring back at you with stern faces and seriously amazing handlebar moustaches. When I first began cleaning this building with my team, we would occasionally have odd things happen. A door might swing shut behind us when there was no breeze. Items maybe moved slightly from where we had just set them down. These were all things that we could easily brush off as just a result of us being busy and distracted. Cleaning a bar is hard work after all. Then things started to happen that we just couldn't easily explain away. One morning, my teenage son arrived a little before the rest of the crew. We were just finishing up at another job and He began emptying the garbage. From somewhere deep within the building, he heard an odd rattling noise that was familiar, but he just couldn't place it. As he tells it, he tried to ignore it by turning up the music in his AirPods, but the determined rattling persisted. As he rounded the corner into the hallway behind the bar, he found the source of the noise. On a table stood a large mesh cylinder made of brass with a crank handle at one end. This device was used for mixing plastic bingo balls. The handle was slowly turning itself, making full rotations as the balls rattled around inside. A few weeks after the bingo ball incident, we were again cleaning the bar in the early hours of the morning. Suddenly, the fully electronic jukebox broke the silence by turning itself on at full volume. It then proceeded to play 3 consecutive songs that I can only accurately describe as sea shanties, the type of old sailors' melodies that have no business at all being on a modern jukebox. After the 3 songs, the jukebox abruptly turned off and never made a sound again at any time over the many years of daily cleanings. My sense as I share these stories with you now is that I never felt menaced exactly, but something is in that bar and it wanted to be certain that we knew it was there with us. So thank you very much for your story, Lindsay. The thing I love the most about that story actually is not the haunted story. That's great. But the fact that you mentioned this building, and I go to a club just like that to play snooker with a friend of mine. It's an old working man's club. It's an old railway club in England. And I'm amazed that we have such similar like venues and almost, because these are quite deeply ingrained in the culture, like a bit like you mentioned, they're very like deep parts of the community, I guess. And it's just amazing that we have those, even though, we're both completely different countries with, quite strongly different cultures. And yet we still have these kind of things in common. So I found that, just an enjoyable little side note, but also a terrifying one, because that building that I go to is terrifying. It's this old Victorian building that's just up from the train station, and all of that area is old Victorian buildings. And this one is like this huge kind of labyrinthine building, and all the lights are sort of don't quite work properly. And when we leave, it's always dark. And now I'm just going to be thinking of your story and terrified and freaking myself out as to whether or not it might be haunted, because it's a dodgy building for sure. But anyway, thank you very much for your story. And that leads us on to our last story of 2025 Christmas campfires. This one comes from Amanda. And Amanda says, in 2018, my husband and I planned a Memorial Day weekend getaway with our 7-year-old son. We lived on the California coast, and Borrego Springs, I think that might not be how you say that, with its quiet desert charm, was just a 2-hour drive away. A few days before the trip, our weekend rental called to say that they'd double booked us. They promised to find comparable alternative accommodations. To say that I was sceptical about how comparable any available lodgings would be just before the holiday weekend would be understating things. My husband remained optimistic, as the worst case scenario was a drive home. We drove up early that Saturday morning, and we spent a good part of the day off-roading in dune buggies at Osatillo Wells. We finished up at around 3 o'clock, and we slapped the worst of the dust out of our clothing. My husband pulled up the information that he'd been sent for our alternative accommodation. We drove about half an hour, pulling up to an absolutely beautiful Art Deco time capsule of a hotel. While my husband went to check in, I kept our dusty little gremlin out of the lobby by tracking lizards with him in the parking lot. When my husband returned, he didn't start grabbing our bags. Instead, he directed us to get back in the car. Somewhat confused and concerned that maybe the alternative accommodations hadn't worked out, I helped my son into the car before getting in myself. To my surprise, rather than turning toward the main road, we turned onto a small dirt access road and followed it for a bit. Then we made a left onto another small dirt road, and finally a third left into what looked like a construction laydown area, stacks of lumber, piled dirt, and a couple of shipping containers sprinkled around a parking lot. I realised that we'd made a rough circle and driven around to the back of the hotel. Our room, on the second floor, was up one exterior flight of white painted wooden stairs. There were 2 doors to the room, which was quite large, with 2 queen beds, a small sofa, chairs, side tables, a table, mini fridge and television. The beds were on the north side of the spacious suite, which looked to have been created by knocking down and framing out the shared wall between 2 standard rooms. Before any beds or furniture could be bounced on by our energetic little gremlin, I bounced him straight into the shower with the promise to check out the pool after we grabbed a bite at the hotel cafe. We got to the hotel's restaurant just in time, we were told, as it would be closing that evening. We ordered sandwiches, fries, 2 beers, 1 fruit juice, and 1 plain hamburger with only ketchup and definitely no onions or pickles, and sat on the patio in the late afternoon sun. There was a gentleman playing the piano just through the open lobby doors, so the music created a nice ambience for us. Eventually, the boy knocked 1 too many pieces of silverware off the table, trying to build some sort of utensil fort, and I banished him to the grassy side yard just next to the cafe seating area. This was a small yard, about 60 feet by 20 or 25 feet, with a hedge boundary that I felt confident that the boy wouldn't make it through before one of us could retrieve him. He ran zigzags across the grass, occasionally lunging at the shrubs. "What is that boy doing?" my husband asked. I looked closer. I was just teasing rabbits. What a knucklehead. Sure enough, desert bunnies, at least a dozen, had crept out of the hedges and were now his playmates. For the next 15 minutes, it was boy versus bunnies, and when we finished dining, he didn't want to leave his new game or new friends. But when his eyes lit on the pool, all bunny business was forgotten. We swam until nightfall, and then my husband ran out to get some evening snacks whilst I dried off and cleaned up my little adventurer. After his bath, he began the long-delayed furniture bouncing that seems to be the inalienable right of children. I wasn't concerned about making too much noise, as the room below was the closed dining room. My husband came back with pizza and other snacks to find my son hiding in a pillow fort on the sofa, carefully popping his head out like a meerkat whilst I nonchalantly pretended that I wasn't throwing pillows at him. "Pizza party," he shrieked, and burst from his fort like a pint-sized Hulk. Eventually, it was bedtime for Mr. 7-year-old. There was a typical attempt to bargain for more time, followed by complaints about how mean I am. The absolute meanest, if you're wondering. And finally, teeth were brushed, blankets were tucked in, and stories were told. I expected him to pop out of bed as soon as I settled back in the living room side of the suite, especially as I realised that I could just hear music playing somewhere. To our surprise, the kid just zonked out immediately. My husband and I settled on the sofa, sharing another couple of beers and snacking on leftover pizza crusts, and occasionally we commented on what a great party there seemed to be happening downstairs. Besides the music, we could hear occasional voices drifting up. We guessed that this party was the reason the restaurant had closed early, and we tried to imagine what kind of occasion was being celebrated downstairs. Finally, we were also ready for bed. I realised that I needed to get a toiletry case from the Jeep, so I stepped out into the deep darkness and utter stillness of the desert. As I went down the staircase, I could see that the dining room was dark and closed up. Feeling the beginnings of los espookies, as my husband would say, I rushed to get my case and get back into the room. Only when I got back to the room, the door was shut and locked. I knocked, kind of annoyed that my husband would play a silly prank like this on me. I'd been out of the room no more than maybe 2 or 3 minutes. The door locks were old manual locks, which had to be turned either with the key or from the inside of the room. I knocked again, louder, and peered through the window. The lights were all on the living room side of the suite. I moved over to the window by the bedroom and knocked there. I couldn't see as well, since the curtains were mostly drawn, but I could make out the shape of my husband, sprawled flat on his back, fast asleep. I knocked repeatedly for what seemed like forever, before he finally started awake and was genuinely surprised to find me locked outside. I brushed my teeth and tidied up a little bit, turned off the lights, and as soon as I climbed into the bed, the apparent sleep spell on that side of the room took hold, and I was in dreamland until morning. Morning with the small boy comes quite early, and he woke us parents up in the time-honoured fashion of jumping from his bed to ours and landing squarely on his father's stomach. We got breakfast from the cafe to go, and whilst chatting with the hostess, we asked about the dining room directly below our room and the party that was held the previous night. She showed us the inside of the dining room, clearly undergoing renovations. We left with our food shortly after, a little bit confused and admittedly curious about what we could have been hearing the night before. Mr. Smallhead Big Ears caught the conversation from the back seat and jumped straight to the conclusion that my husband and I were tiptoeing around. "Mum, we just stayed at a haunted hotel," he announced gleefully. He then declared the slot canyon we hiked later was also haunted, which meant that our hike turned into a breathless run through imaginary ghost territory. That evening, post-swim, my son went into a serious mode and demanded an investigation. He inspected the locks on all the doors, he recreated my walk to and from the Jeep, and he sat inside the room whilst I knocked on the window, and then he went downstairs to peek into the dining room one last time. Satisfied, he declared that the only conclusion was ghosts, and that they should stay away from him because he was just a boy. We ended the night playing Uno and slept without incident. The next day, we checked out late, squeezing in as much pool time as possible. A quick internet search after we returned home confirmed the renovations, but I could find no mention of any ghost stories, just one interesting detail. The hotel was advertised as adults only. Thank you very much for your story, Amanda. And I would just say that if that was me, I would be keeping a close eye on my husband in case he decided writing a book on a typewriter somewhere or anything of that nature. Anyway, thank you very much for your stories, everyone, this year. It's been another great Christmas campfire. We've had another 2 great episodes. So it just leaves me now to, I hope you had a great holidays and Happy New Year. I will be back in the new year with a new season. And I've got a bit of a bonus episode sort of for Patreon in between then and now, which is really just sort of cleaning up a few sort of loose ends that I had from last season. But yeah, I'll be back in the new year. Yeah, until then, Happy New Year. I wish you, your family, your loved ones, great and prosperous 2026. Happy New Year. Cheers.